Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Jake from College Football Red Zone reporting in. And in today's video, I just wanted to take some time to really talk about something that's been on the back of my mind as we go ahead and progress through the end of the regular season, as well as progress deeper into the bowl season, as well as deeper into the college football playoff with the remaining round one games wrapping up late tonight as I am recording this video. And one of the things I think we can all agree on, regardless of what team we root for, what conference does our affiliation lie in, is there is some significant issues going on with the college football calendar, and there are certain aspects of our sport that genuinely need to be revamped in order to maintain the level of popularity. Because right now, while popularity is at an all-time high, that is at the benefit of decent decision making that was made in the 2010s. At the same time, we're kind of at this fork in the road where, there's a lot of change happening in the sport. And if we don't get it right, then we could really see a true fall off of the sport, and that would be, a big tragedy for sure. Because I love college football, but at the same time, you have to also acknowledge that some of the adhesives, as Josh Pate will talk about, is completely out of whack. So what I wanted to talk about in this video here today is recognize that, hey, the college football calendar, it is completely out of whack as of right now, and it's in some desperate need of reform. And I think, after what we saw with, like Lane Kiffin, for example, going to like LSU, as well as some other things that's happened over the last couple of years, I think there is a pretty clear consensus that there is a problem. There is a problem with particularly the calendar for college football, but there isn't necessarily a consensus in terms of, how do we go about fixing the problems that currently stand in our way as a sport. So, as the little bit of a hot thought experiment here, because again, this is something that's been on the forefront of my mind like the past few days. I really want to talk about, hey, what if, let's just say for shits and giggles, I am the hypothetical college football commissioner. As the commissioner of college football, what changes would I make in order to ensure, not only maintaining the traditions and the pageantry of college football and what really makes this sport so special and so unique compared to every other sport on the planet, while also at the main time driving the sport towards the future as smoothly as possible. So, I'm gonna lay this down in four different, I guess, portions. I'm gonna be talking about the foundation of my vision for college football, as well as talking about the regular season itself, talking about the people that are involved, and finally, of course, the off season, in order to have a calendar that makes sense from when we kick off the first game and all the way through when we're starting to have those summer and fall camps, as well as seeing those conference media days, a year-line calendar, but also at the same time a year-line calendar that also makes sense. So appreciate you listening through the entirety of what we got going on in terms of, hey, college football needs some serious change, but let's see if we can make some positive change here as the hypothetical college football commissioner. If you are excited to enjoy this video, make sure to go ahead, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button as well if you do happen to be brand new. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it, with the first portion being the foundation. And the foundation that we're going to lie here on in terms of how we are going to change the vision of college football is what we want to lay out here in this foundation is the changes that we make in this part is going to really set the groundwork for everything else. Is going to make everything else in this video make so much more sense. And so for me, I think one of the, I guess, top changes I would make right away is really get back to a point where we have conferences that physically make sense. I think the biggest problem that we're facing right now, and that's not even with our college football playoff, it's not even with the conference tiebreakers itself, It's the fact that we just have conferences that are just way too big right now, particularly, with the four power conferences at the moment. Whether you're talking about the Big 12 and the SEC, who has 16 teams in its conference, the ACC has 17 right now, and even the Big 10, like that is an 18 team conference. That's almost a miniature league in itself. So, all of these conferences, what they have in common is they are way too large in order to effectively manage, in order to even feel like a conference. Because look at the ACC, for example. They're playing an 8 game schedule, and so you're talking about maybe playing half of your conference tops. And while the ACC is working on transitioning to a 9 game schedule, if you have seen the ACC conference opponents listed for 2026, the conference is so big that it's mathematically impossible for everyone to play 9 conference games. Do you have a handful of teams that play 8 conference games while the rest of the ACC next year is going to play 9 conference games? It's just complete insanity that in the big 2025, we are going to have teams play a different amount of conference games within the conference. And not only does it create scheduling issues like the ACC is going to face next year, but what this also does, because these conferences are way too big, is it does create significant disparities in terms of strength of schedule. It is frankly a lot easier to dodge some of the better teams in your conference, and that makes it, even within the conference, it creates that disparity. Duke is a really good example in this, right? Because Duke didn't have to play Miami, right? They didn't have to play, who else? They didn't have to necessarily play SMU either. Some of the better teams that are in the ACC, Duke was able to go ahead and avoid. And as a result of that, and on top of, the tiebreakers being so convoluted, Duke, as a 7-5 team in the regular season, was able to play for a conference title in a power conference. When you have teams ranked in the top 25, like Miami and Virginia, Miami not getting a chance to play for the ACC title, even though they only have a couple of losses, same conference record as Duke. SMU was also another team that had consideration. Same ditto with the Pitt Panthers as well, who had a really good season. And then even looking at the G5, I mean the Mountain West had to resort to computer metrics in order to figure out who is playing in their conference championship games. So all of this happened because again, the conferences are way too big, which makes it easier to avoid certain teams in the regular season. So not in order to provide relief to the majority of the issues that we face within the actual season itself, we just need to make sure that we do a better job of balancing the conferences. And so, as the hypothetical commissioner of college football, before any discussion should be had on changes to the regular season format as well as changes to the playoff format, addressing the conference situation has to be addressed first and foremost, which is why I drafted up my version of how would I have the conferences structured within the ranks of the FBS with our current 136 teams in FBS football. What would those conferences look like that would actually be back at a reasonable size, as well as manage to go and maximize the regionality of the sport, as well as make sure that that strength of schedule is somewhat similar, regardless of, who you end up missing in the conference, or at least a very minimal number. So, with that being said, this is how I have the conferences listed in terms of maximizing the regionality of the college football, because that's what makes this sport special in the first place, as well as really paving a way in terms of how I want to go about handling the regular season schedule and how that's going to be handled on a year-to-year basis, as well as, what would my ideal college football playoff format be these conferences will pave the way for the other changes I want to make. So I'm going to go ahead and throw them up on my screen. And what you can see, because I'm not going to read, like what every list of like every change that I made, because you guys can pause the video. And if you really want to pause the video and check all the changes, you can do that. But generally, a few things that I did. One, I made sure that each conference is at a relatively even size, right? So each conference has 12 to 13 teams, which is a lot more manageable. And you get to a point where, it feels more like a conference. You have more camaraderie with your conference mates, with how things are brought back. Now, one conference that I did bring back to life, because even if, I went ahead and, just balanced everything equally from the get-go, is even then there wasn't enough conferences, because I wanted to keep it. I think 12 to 14 teams is about the sweet spot, right? Preferably closer to like 10 to 12. So this is the best way to get there while conferences are relatively even in size. Every conference only has 12 to 13 members. So I did decide to revive the Big East first and foremost, because I look at all of these new programs that have burst onto the scene since the Big East ended up disappearing, and the American Conference took its place. Many of those conferences, like new FBS programs that we see, are primarily over on the East Coast. We haven't seen any new programs west of the state of Texas burst onto the scene in the last 10 to 15 years. Matter of fact, I think that number has declined slightly because Idaho has opted to move out of the FBS ranks and head down to the FCS level completely. So there's actually more of a shift towards the East Coast, which is why when I decided to bring the idea of bringing a conference back to life, I felt like the Big East made so much sense in doing so, because of more of the focus generally on the East Coast. Now, a few other things that I did as well is, listen, in this reality, I didn't think it made sense to have any more football independence, so I did force Notre Dame and UConn. Both of you guys are going to join a conference. And for UConn, it was pretty straightforward because of the fact that we did end up bringing the Big East back as an FBS football conference. It made the perfect sense to put UConn back into the Big East. So that was pretty straightforward. Notre Dame, on the other hand, that was a little bit more on the interesting side, though, because while they play in the ACC for other sports, and they do also have the scheduling agreement currently with the ACC, I really felt that geographically and arguably culturally as well, I thought Notre Dame, made a little bit more sense being in the Big Ten, with the Big Ten being a little bit more of, your power conference that's a little bit more Midwestern oriented. And you get to be in the same conference as Ohio State, Michigan State, Indiana, Purdue, the schools that are all close to Notre Dame, right? So I felt like that made a lot of sense, putting them in the Big Ten from that aspect, being that Midwestern centric kind of conference. Now, a few other things that I did decide to add James Madison and Memphis to the ACC, because of how I decided to organize like the current ACC teams. Some moved to the Big East, some moved back over to the other conferences as well. Need a couple of teams in the ACC. Went with James Madison and Memphis because I thought those would be good sports ads. James Madison really been on the up and up since they've joined the FBS. Really should have been given the opportunity to play for the Sun Belt Championship in 2022 and 2023. Didn't necessarily happen. They got a college football playoff working. While that's currently not working out very well as the recording of this video, James Madison really, as a athletics department, that is really on the rise, so I wanted to get them some love. And then Memphis, with how much emphasis the ACC has in basketball, Memphis historically has been pretty good in terms of its basketball prowess. So I wanted to add Memphis in there. Football's been pretty good as well, with what like Mike Norvell, ironically enough, has done, as well as what Ryan Silverfield has been able to accomplish. We'll see what Charles Huff can do as well. So that's why I added those two teams into the ACC. BYU, I decided to add BYU to the Pac-12 because I wanted to keep the Holy War rivalry within the same conference. I didn't want this to be like a non-conference rivalry that happens on a day in and like a year in year out basis. Wanted to keep that in the conference, and BYU fits in really well in terms of where the rest of the teams in that conference are located. So that's why I have BYU in the Pac-12. UMass, I did add UMass to the Big East, not because I think necessarily UMass could compete super well with the rest of the teams in the Big East. It was really tough for me to figure out what to do with UMass because from a football's perspective, I mean, we've seen how they've done against MAC competition. They've been blown out in almost every game, so that was really tough. But at the same time, I did have UConn and Boston College, both in the Big East already. So I figured if UMass was going to get killed anyways, at least they would have their local rivalries, being able to maintain those a little bit better. So that was why UMass was added to the Big East. That was not for a football perspective. That was more for the rivalries. Charlotte, Charlotte, I moved back to the Conference USA. I think they would compete a little bit better there from a football perspective. And at the same time, most of who we see from the Conference USA is on the East Coast. So for the most part, would cut down travel for Charlotte. So I thought be a solid geographical fit for the 49ers. And then finally, New Mexico State. I went ahead and put them into the Mountain West. I moved them from the Conference USA because I wanted to have the rivalry with New Mexico in the same conference as well. Again, maximizing the regionality and having conference sizes that actually make sense. That is our two biggest priorities. And then finally, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but one thing that I really wanted to take care of was I wanted to make sure that, hey, let's get rid of some of these convoluted tiebreakers. So, in order to avoid any confusion, I would make sure that regardless of conference affiliation, tiebreakers, they would become standard across the board. So, therefore, regardless of what conference you're in, if there is a tie within that conference, you would be using the same tiebreakers. So you don't have to like look up like separate rules for separate conferences. You make it a little bit uniform, you make it more consistent across the board. And my tiebreakers would work in this fashion. Obviously, the first tiebreaker would be head-to-head results. If Team A played Team B on a field and Team B beat Team A and they're tied at the end of the year, then Team B should be ahead of Team A in the conference standings. Let's Okay, but let's say that for whatever reason those two teams didn't play each other. Maybe it's like the one or two conference opponents that they ended up avoiding. Well, then the next thing I would go to record versus conference common opponents. So that's pretty self-explanatory. If Team A missed out on playing Team B, but Team A had a better record versus their common opponents than Team B, then Team A would be ahead of Team B in the standings. Pretty straightforward. The third tiebreaker I would have would be conference strength of schedule, and it'll be purely on an overall win-loss standpoint. So if one team had a better win-loss record overall, regardless of strength of schedule over the other team, and that's how that would be determined. But if that was still somehow tied, then I would go to the final tiebreaker that I would have. It would be national ranking. In the event that it reaches the fourth tiebreaker and neither team is ranked within the top 25, there would be a ranking committee, which I'll dive into a little bit more detail later. But they would continue to rank teams until a winner can be determined. Now, I do want to go into as I dive into like the next big part of really fixing college football in a nutshell. So, as I talk about the season itself, you would also notice that the tiebreakers don't just determine who would win the conference, but these tiebreakers that I mentioned would apply to every other conference position as well. And there is a very specific reason for that. That is because my intent, and that's another thing that I wanted to fix, was the scheduling, is that a team's ending position within the conference would be used to help determine a team's non-conference schedule. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, when it comes to the regular season, I think a 12-game regular season still makes a lot of sense. So the 12-game regular season would remain the same. What I would change is I would still create uniformity in terms of, how many conference games are played on a yearly basis. So no more of this, some conferences play 8 games, some of the other conferences play 9 games. We're going to go ahead and put a stop to that right away. We are going to have a 10-game conference schedule, regardless of what conference you're in. Now, the other two games are obviously going to be non-conference related. And again, when we're building out these schedules, what are we going to do? Make sure that we're honoring our rivalries so that, rivalries are going to be played every single year, as well as maximize the feeling of regionality in the sport, as well as maintaining the traditions that we have in college football. So even though we're making changes to the scheduling format across the board, we're putting an emphasis on rivalries, we're putting an emphasis on regionality, and an emphasis on maintaining traditions as much as possible. So, how would the two non-conference games work? Okay. So, if someone had a rival in another conference, they would automatically, play that game, year in and year out. So Cincinnati and Miami of Ohio, for example, they have a rivalry with each other, but they are in different conferences. One thing that I would do as the college football commissioner is make sure that that rivalry game happens on a yearly basis. Now, as for, let's say there is still an open spot after accounting for any non-conference rivalries. So let me go ahead and use the Cincinnati Bearcats, for example. Let's say hypothetically in this scenario, the Cincinnati Bearcats finish fourth place overall in the Big East during in the previous season. So you got the Miami game. That would be one of your non-conference games. You would still have one more remaining. What would then happen is a random conference would be determined, and whatever that random conference ends up landing on, you would play, the fourth place team, from a different conference. So let's say that, Cincinnati gets the benefit of playing somebody from the SEC, for example. Just throwing that out there. So what would happen is whoever finished fourth in the SEC, that would be Cincinnati's other opponent. And that what that would do is help create non-conference matchups that would be more exciting, and it would be dependent on how teams finished the previous season. So, another example for like for shits and giggles is, let's say like Ohio State. Ohio State finishes in the top two. They would play another top two team from another conference. You would get those not huge non-conference games early, and it would be determined by the commissioner's office at random. What that would also do is that FBS teams, they would also no longer have access to playing against an FCS opponent during the regular season. And neutral site games would also be a thing of the past as well, unless it's a very notable exception, such as the Red River rivalry that's played between Texas and Oklahoma. There is going to be exceptions, but for the most part, we're going to make sure that, games are going to happen on home campuses. And what we're also going to do is reduce the number of buy games that happen on a yearly basis, especially when, and the SEC is certainly guilty of this, but Clemson, for example, this year is guilty of this as well. You got teams that in the second half of the season playing an FCS opponent, and while almost everyone this year played against an FCS team, what happened at the same time was, hey, losses, I guess, are weighted more heavily than losses early on in this season. So we're going to get rid of the FCS games, the FBS for FCS games. There will be an opportunity for it still, but not in the regular season. I'll touch up on that later. So, with that being said, as for the rest of the regular season format, that would actually remain it would actually remain somewhat similar to what it is now in the sense of, trying to start on the second to last week in August. However, one minor tweak that I would make is instead of making like week number 0, for example, where we only have like a small handful of teams play and then most of the rest of the FBS starts their season at week number 1. I would consider week number 0 to be the official start of the college football season and make that a full-fledged league. So let's say in the context of this year, I would have the regular season run from August 23rd through November 22nd. That would be the end of the regular season right there. Now, as the season goes on, going from the preseason and going throughout the duration of the regular season, rankings are going to be held by a centralized ranking committee. There's been a lot of backlash with how certain people in the AP handled their ballots this year. We're going to take the AP people out of the equation here. We are going to have a centralized ranking committee that is going to consist of 12 people who have in-depth knowledge of the sport and has time to watch various games from various leagues throughout the season in order to form the most educated opinion as possible. And we're going to make sure that these people are not tied to any athletic department in order to remove as much bias as possible. As for who would make up these 12 people, how I would structure it is have at least one person that covers each conference in depth. So someone that specializes in the Big East, for example, would be one person. Someone that would specialize in the Sun Belt would be one person. So that would be your 11 members. And then you would have one general person that has some of that in-depth knowledge at a national level, that 50,000 feet level. Josh Pate, that kind of type, would be utilized like for that national committee member. Wouldn't necessarily be the head, but yeah, these rankings, they would be released once a week, starting at least 7 days prior to the start of the season. So you would have some preseason rankings, but it'll be more educated preseason rankings, and then you would run through the duration of the year, and you don't need to necessarily have a like a show every week. I can kind of take it or leave it from that part. I'm actually pretty indifferent. So okay, so we have the regular season fleshed out. We have the foundation laid out. Let's talk about the playoff format and then the schedule for the playoff. All right, so we made it for the regular season. So now it's time to figure out what teams will be involved in terms of competing for the national championship. Now, candidly, I actually do not have a problem with the current CFP formula format as it is right now with the 12-team playoff, and you have your top 5 conference champions regardless of whether it's a power conference or a group of 5 conference automatically receiving an auto bid. However, running a multi-team playoff to determine a national champion and maintaining the current traditions of bowl season, to be honest, is no longer feasible. And I think that's evident by, the number of opt-outs that we have seen in bowl season. It is actually more often than not what we've seen is most teams in bowl season are not at full strength. It is much more rare to see a team at full strength than it is not see a team from full strength due to opt-outs because they're entering the transfer portal or they're preparing for the NFL draft. So I no longer see it as feasible. So what we need to do is reimagine how the playoff is going to work, as well as how bowl season is going to work moving forward. And I'm going to touch on bowl season specifically in a second, but going to the playoff itself, if we were to expand the college football playoff further, I would be supportive of adopting the FCS playoff model to determine our national champion. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the FCS playoff model, it is a 2014 playoff that guarantees every conference champion an opportunity to compete for the national championship. So, how would that work in the confines of FBS football? So, you would have two types of teams make it into this reimagined college football playoff. One of those teams would be your conference champions, honestly, would represent the best team out of each of the conferences, whether it's the ACC, the Big Ten, the American, etc., etc. That would be your first 11 bids. They would all be conference champions. And then after that, you would take 13 of the next best teams, the next highest ranked teams that did not win their conference, and that would round out your 24 team field. And that would be, of course, taken care of by that same centralized ranking committee that is responsible for pushing out the top 25. So your ranking committee that started ranking teams in the preseason, they would also be responsible for the final rankings that would determine who would make your 24 team playoff, and it would be a straight seeding basis. So you don't get any special consideration if you win your conference championship, and there would not be consideration either to whether the two teams that get matched up happen to be from the same conference or travel logistics. We're not going to worry about that. The FCS takes that a little bit more into consideration, but we're not going to do that here. Now, once the playoff teams have been determined, the other major aspect that needs to be discussed when it comes to the college football playoff itself is determining where these games should be played. As of right now, our national championship game is decided on a random Monday night, with multiple other playoff games occurring in the middle of the week. Now, which again just seems absolutely insane considering college football on Saturdays. That's college football's day. Saturdays are for college football. We need to have our playoff games, all of them, closer to that Saturday timeline. So, because the first and second round are, you're talking about 8 games in the first round, you got 8 games as well in the second round too. You're not probably not going to be able to get all of those games in on Saturday. So, the first couple of rounds, you're talking about getting, maybe 4 games on Friday and 4 games on Saturday, and you would do that with the first and second round. But then once you get into the quarterfinal, I would have every quarterfinal game on Saturday. I would have both of these semifinal games on Saturday. And finally, and most importantly, I would have the national championship game on a Saturday. Also, what we're going to do, because home playoff games have been such a joy, we're going to make sure that those first couple of rounds are taking place on home campuses so that the teams that do end up getting a bye, they get an opportunity as well to host a home playoff game on their home campus, which, by the way, the top 8 seeded teams, which I should have mentioned earlier, the top 8 seeded teams in this playoff model would get a bye into the second round, similar to how things work now, just scaling up on a little bit of a higher level. All right. Once we get into the quarterfinal, though, then what I would do is use the traditional New Year's Six Bowl sites and then have a random site for a national championship every year. I don't mind that part. So before we kind of dive into how I think the it would work in terms of like timing logistics, the only other question that I was trying to think about was really what to do with the Army Navy game. And again, with the Army, in respect to the Army Navy game, we're going to try our best to maintain the traditions of college football while also starting the playoff in a timely manner. So what I did here was I tried my best to move. I did move the Army and Navy game technically, but I moved it as little as possible. And it's around the same time frame. So here's how it would work. So November 22nd, we talked about this daylight here earlier, and I'm talking about in the aspect of our current calendar, the 2025 calendar. So November 22nd, the regular season would end. And then the day after the end of the regular season, we're going to have the selection day for the college football playoff. We are going to get rid of conference championship games because we do have those tiebreakers in place, and just about everyone is going to play everyone. So we won't have a need for conference championship games. So the 23rd, the day after the end of the regular season, is going to be your selection day. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a full week off, and then the following week is going to be the start of the playoffs. During that bye week, so November 29th, the Saturday after the end of the regular season, there's only going to be one game on for college football, and that's it. Hmm. Excuse me. And it's going to be the Army Navy game. It's going to be the only game that's going to be on. It's going to, of course, same rules apply. It's not going to count towards regular season record. You're going to play that on a Saturday before the start of the playoffs. So then, December 5th and 6th, the first Friday and first Saturday in December, is going to be your first round of playoff games. You would have playoff games every week until January 3rd. That would be the first Saturday in January. That is going to be our national championship game that we're going to have on January 3rd, which is still a significant improvement from what we have right now, where I believe, like New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, we're just going to get into quarterfinal games. We're going to address that then and there, so we'll get through the season a little bit faster in a little bit more of a timely manner. So that is going to be your regular season format, and that's going to be your playoff format as well. All right, just need to take a breath. I'll get a little bit long-winded. By the way, really appreciate you guys listening through this whole thing. And again, if you haven't done so already, make sure you go ahead, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button as well. Gonna be doing stuff like this all through this season that we're gonna embark on, where isn't gonna be any college football games to actually talk about. So definitely want to strap things up. We got some big things planned over the span of the next 6 to 8 months. So definitely check in with us. So let's go ahead and jump into the third part of this, and that's really the people. Now, one thing that I also really wanted to tackle as a hypothetical college football commissioner is really tackling how coaches and players move as we transition from one season to a brand new season of college football. And that's really one of the major issues that we have right now is that timing. Because right now, what we're seeing is that coaches and players alike, they're essentially forced into a position where they can either finish the current season out with their current team or they can leave their current team in the late stages of the season in order to prepare for their next step and their next opportunity, i.e., seeing more opt-outs, for those that are players or teams, coaches that would not be able to coach in either the CFP or in the bowl game because they're preparing for their next coaching opportunity. So we're trying to avoid that. And really, the perfect example of that is Lane Kiffin, who had to make a choice between staying at Ole Miss and either between that or accepting the LSU job in the midst of Ole Miss trying to make it into the college football playoff. We're trying to avoid that as much as possible because if this were to ever happen in the NFL where we see a coach leave in the middle of someone's NFL season, it would be labeled as complete insanity. So therefore, we got to put rules in place that are in the best interest of the players as well as in the best interest of the coaches so that there can be an orderly process in place where people don't have to decide whether to finish their season out with their current team or opt out early. And I think the biggest thing that we can do here not only is adjust timelines, but also have better enforcement in terms of when coaches and players can be contacted. And that would be like a big thing of emphasis for me as college football commissioner. So in the NFL, for example, coaches can't be contacted for new opportunities until they have finished out their current season with their current team. So that's how it would apply to coaches. And then for the players should not be contacted by a different school in regards to potential roster opportunities until after that player has decided that they want to opt into the transfer portal, i.e., let's make sure that we're actually cutting out the tampering. And what this is going to do is going to create less chaos for both the coaches and the players who can now focus on the task at hand. However, rules are no good if there is no enforcement mechanism to enforce those rules, right? Because the NCAA has shown that they are very ineffective in enforcing their own rules. And so that's another thing as well as college football commissioner. We are getting the NCAA out of our business in terms of college football because we need centralized leadership. So Here's how I would enforce it if I was college football commissioner. If it's been found out that an offending team has contacted a coach before the end of that current coach's season or has compelled a player to enter the transfer portal, then that offending team would be ineligible for the playoffs for the following season. We are going to make it hard for players for make it in a sense where, hey, you're going to cost your team an opportunity to possibly win a national championship, regardless of what you do in the regular season. Use that as the enforcement arm, as well as, going out and finding schools as well, using those two mechanisms to really discourage any kind of tampering, either with coaches or players. Now, speaking of the transfer portal, we're also going to change when players can transfer in the transfer portal, right? Because right now, while it's a little bit better this year, we still have a spot where, we still have bowl games happening, we still have playoff games happening, the transfer portal opening up at the same time, which again is completely insane. But it also, again, puts coaches and players in a bind with potentially splitting focus on preparing for the grind of the national championship and preparing for the next opportunity. So, again, as the High Federal Conference Football Commissioner, we are going to change that right away, too. We are going to make sure that games are done before the transfer portal actually opens up. And that's why I want to move the transfer portal to the start of 1 week after the national championship game. So we talked about how, like in the context of this calendar year, you would have the national championship game on January 3rd of 2026. So January 10th of 2026, hypothetically, if I was college football commissioner, that would be when the transfer portal would open up, and you would have the rest of the month of January in order to decide whether you want to enter a transfer portal or not want to enter a transfer portal. You would still have 3 weeks to decide, which is should be more than enough. Okay. So not only will we change when a transfer portal is happening, that January 10th to the end of January timeline, another aspect I want to tackle as well is putting a limit back on how many times a player can actually enter the transfer portal during their collegiate career. Now, I'm not saying that straight up they can't transfer more than X amount of times because things do happen. And I am fully supportive of players being able to move as well as players being paid. But at the same time, having someone transfer to 7 different schools over the span of a college career, and yes, I'm looking at you, TJ Finley, it's gotten completely out of hand. That being said, I do want to recognize that, hey, we're talking about 17 and 18-year-olds making arguably biggest decision of their life. For many of these young people, going to sometimes make a decision that might be viewed with a little bit of regret later on, which is why players should get the initial opportunity to transfer without losing out on eligibility for future seasons. However, it should only happen one time. This idea of transferring, multiple times, we should try to slow down a little bit. Now, that being said, I do think that there should be exceptions for that, right? Like if the head coach is no longer with the program for any reason, or if a player has already gotten their undergraduate degree and is seeking a graduate school education, that's fine. Or shoot, with what happened with Akron this year, if the entire team is ineligible for the playoffs due to academic reasons, i.e., not meeting those APR scores, but the player that has been in college for at least 2 semesters and is good at in good academic standing, that player should be able to transfer without any repercussions. But if it's not for any of those specific reasons and he wants to transfer more than one time, then he needs to sit out for a full year, just like how it was, like in the early to mid like 2000s through to mid 2010s. That way, players still have an opportunity to transfer if their initial choice didn't turn out to be the right fit for any reason. And it also still allows for players to transfer in unique situations, but also make sure that, hey, we're not abusing the transfer portal throughout their college career either, just because you didn't like how things ended up for a year for whatever reason, right? Okay, so got the transfer limit, we got the calendar. There's one more thing regarding the transfer portal that I really want to implement before I get into really talking about the signing day process. And that's really instituting a transfer fee system. So, listen, there is no secret that while the transfer portal has helped disperse talent across a different number of power conference programs, what has largely happened, as well as that the group of five programs, they would develop these players who were under recruited but turn out to be diamonds in the rough. Then they would end up getting poached by power conference program, and the power conference program, like if that player would end up going to the NFL, even though the group of five did the majority of the work in developing these players, the the power conference team gets all of the credit for that person making it to the NFL. Nobody even thinks about the G5 team that initially found them and uh, developed him from the get go. And so the G5 puts in all of this work to develop these players. And if they go to a power conference program, they have nothing to show for it. So, and that's why because these G5 programs, they do not have, and I'm speaking in generalities, right? Generally speaking, they don't have the same NIL funding that these larger programs have, right? Like Oregon and James Madison, they are working with largely different NIL budgets right now. So that's why I want to have a transfer fee system so that way, if a player does really good and moves up for that reason, at least the smaller program or the losing program gets compensated in some way, shape, or form. So, what we need to do is then try to figure out okay, how are we going to go about making sure that, hey, we are going to, like, how are we going to determine what that transfer fee would be? I guess is what I'm trying to say. And what I will say is we can use initial baseline from websites like OnFree, who actually does a really good job in at least providing like an initial estimate for the average college football fan. So we would use that NIL valuation from like an onfree.com, for example, to get the initial estimate. But then we would also need some other guidelines as well to account for what the player has actually accomplished during the course of his college career. So this is how I would set it up for every player that is in the transfer portal, regardless of what they accomplish. Okay. So there's going to be three tiers to this. One is going to be like your base tier, it's a 10% rate. It's going to be the baseline for any player that has not achieved any conference or national awards. This would also apply for someone who hasn't been named to an all conference team or an all American team as well. This is your base tier, and it'll be a 10% rate of the NIL valuation. Then the second tier, it'd be your middle tier, which is a 15% rate. That would be applied to any player that has achieved some type of all conference award or has been named to an all conference team. That's your mid tier. And then your highest tier, your premium tier, is a 20% rate. Would be applied to any player that has achieved some type of national award or has been named an All American in any capacity. So that would be your free tiers that you'll be working from the transfer fee system. And so, an example of this is, let's say DJ Lagway. He has an NIL whose NIL valuation might lie between like $1 to $2 million. I'm just throwing a random number out there. I'm not saying that's what he's actually worth, but he hasn't achieved any end of season awards yet in his college career. So let's shoot in the middle and say OnFree's NIL valuation of DJ Lagway was $1.5 million. After the player entered the transfer portal, if let's say DJ Lagway wanted to go to LSU, then LSU would be responsible for paying Florida $150,000 because 10% of 1.5 million is $150,000. How that is paid out, that could be worked out between the two schools. Now, again, there can be exceptions for the transfer fee being waived. If a player is transferring because the head coach is stepping down, because the team is academically ineligible, or he's already graduated with his undergrad and he's seeking a graduate school education, then the transfer fee won't apply. But for most players, they're not transferring for that reason. And so, with that being said, that's how you would work that out. That way, while the trend of players transferring from generally smaller programs to a more renowned program would continue, if they become stars at their previous schools, it would at least provide a semblance of competitive balance that the smaller schools can use as additional NIL dollars to replenish their rosters effectively or keep some of their other stars on the team. And finally, while a player needs to enter the transfer portal before the end of the transfer period, that same player does not need to make a final decision on where that next school destination will be before the end of said period as well. They just have to be in the portal, but they don't have to make a decision before like the end of the month. They just have to be in the portal before the end of the month. So that would be the transfer portal in a nutshell. And now let's talk about high school recruiting and the JUCO signing period. And this would take place in entirely in the month of February. Now, one of the connecting fabrics of college football that was extremely well captured in the college football video games outside of the PS5 generation was the signing of players from the JUCO and high school ranks. It is one of the adhesive ties that helps form an emotional connection and an emotional bond between the fan and the program. That being said, while signing day is still an event that falls on the calendar every year, it also doesn't carry the same significance as it once posed even 5, 10 years ago. However, what we can do is reconsolidate when the signing period occurs by designating one single period as a time for high school and JUCO athletes to sign. This is because of the fact that we have the early signing period for football athletes, so that when we do actually get that actual signing day, almost everyone in the incoming freshman class has already been signed. It becomes a little bit more of a footnote than anything else. So, hence, while consolidating the signing period to a single 1 month period may not fix everything, I think it would help at least help create some of that old magic that we once had for signing day. So, don't have as much here. Just have four major rules that would have for like the signing period. If a high school and JUCO player like receives an offer, it has to be a committal offer. It cannot be a non-committal offer, so that way we have a better understanding of for that high school player, what programs are actually interested in him and have a spot for him on that team. And then once a player in high school or JUCO actually does receive a committal offer, then that would be included in a centralized database so that we have transparency in terms of what offers this player is receiving, because we do have non-committal offers, which doesn't really tell the full story of how interested a program actually is. Now, a high school player can also commit during any year, so long as he has a committal offer from that program that he can sign with. And then finally, once a player is committed to a school, other schools may not formally contact the player unless the player in question decides to decommit, which can be done at any time, even outside of the signing period. So that would be how I would attack the signing period. Again, I don't really have a ton for like the high school and JUCO signing period, but that would be how I would attack it. But now let's go ahead and talk about the rest of the offseason, as Josh Pay would call it, my part four. And it starts with the spring season where, we're talking about like the beginning of March all the way into the end of May or whenever the spring semester comes to an end. So we got past the transfer portal period and we officially moved past the signing period for high school and JUCO athletes as well. Let's go ahead and jump into the spring months. That certainly, of course, is now where coaches they can enter spring ball, having complete certain on who is going to be a part of their football team, aside from those more severe situations. So, spring practices. As for how spring camp can be conducted, they'll be allowed to conduct spring practices from the first day of March and can run for the end of the spring semester at each institution. And this is where things get really interesting. You know how I talked about bowl season earlier? So I would actually move bowl season here in this spring season. Or I'm talking about bowl season in the spring. Because we are in an era right now, college football, where non-playoff bowl games, they simply do not have the same weight as they had even a decade ago. So in order to keep the bowl season alive, We need to do what's in the best interest of bowl season and move it to a different time of the year that does not directly compete with the college football playoff. That is why I suggest moving the bowl season from its current time frame over to the spring, where it can be conducted any time from the start of March until the end of the spring semester for each individual school. We already have a precursor of what the spring bowl season can be because we would just convert like those spring games that are typically inter squad scrimmages, and those are starting to go away in its own right. And we would turn those into basically inter squad scrimmages between the two teams. So that would be your bowl season in a nutshell. And I think that's what bowl season can serve. It can serve as an opportunity for the coaching staffs to see how their roster can initially look like heading into a new season, as well as provide a better sneak peek for fans that support these programs. And you think about all the inventory that TV networks can have, having a bunch of college football games in the spring. Yes, they would essentially act as preseason games, but I mean, it's still college football games between two different teams. That would be far more entertaining than, like a spring game that would have like differing rules and it's just an inter squad scrimmage. You get better competition and it would just be a lot more fun to watch. And again, it creates a more connection between fans and the schools. Now, this would be between teams that are 6-6 and above. They would be paired up with each other, but that doesn't mean that teams that finish below 500 are just shit out of luck. Because while the bowl season would compose of teams that meet the 6-win threshold during the course of the previous regular season, that doesn't mean these other teams can't participate in this new spring games format. Let's say, if you finish under 500, what you can still do is you can still scrimmage against sub 500 teams, or you can even play against the FCS program at that point. That's where I would allow FCS programs to play FBS programs during the spring season if the FBS team is not that good, but it would not be included in the regular season anymore. So that'll be really how things would be handled from March through May. And then the summer preparation, which would be figuring out what to do with the summer months. And that's going to be the final prep before the actual start of the new season, which is a time period that would still have a few things here. So, you know how we organized the conferences earlier in this video? So we would have a consolidated schedule reveal every year, sometime in the early June time frame. Um, so what we see in the past is that conferences they would roll out their full schedule at different times. We're seeing this right now with the SEC already unveiling a full schedule, and then we're still waiting on all these other conferences. They'll release at a bunch of different times. But what if we centralize it and make it a TV spectacle at the same time? We can do it something similar to what the FIFA does with the group draws, where a random team is picked and then that team would have an entire schedule built out for the upcoming season. Now, because of the number of teams in the FBS, you can either make this an all day or a multi day event or even a full week, depending on how you would want to break it out. Now, biggest priority in building out these schedules would be to ensure rivalries are maintained, regardless of whether or not the matchup resides in the same conference, as well as a healthy rotation of playing conference teams at a reasonable rate, since my conference alignment still isn't to a point where every team would play each other over the course of every season. There would still be, like a team or two in your conference that you wouldn't play, but that's still a lot better than what we have now. So we're making progress there. So that would be how I do it. So when we take my Cincinnati Bearcats as an example, so I talked about how they would play Miami in non-conference and they would play against a random fourth place team from another conference. And then here's the rest of their conference schedule. The only team that they would miss out on is Syracuse. So what I would do with Cincinnati and Syracuse, because they're not playing in the 2026 season, they would automatically play each other in 2027. And then what I would also do is make sure that every team has the same number of home and away games. So each team would have 6 home games and each team would have 6 away games that they would work from as well. And then obviously this process would repeat itself until the schedule of every FBS program that's completely built out. So that would be taking place sometime early in the month of June. Then what you can do after the schedule review is sometime in the mid to late June timeframe. You can have your conference media days, where your conference media days are all happening around the same time. You would accomplish that over the span of like the mid to late, the rest of the month of June after the schedule review, and then finally to wrap things up in the month of July, starting July 1st. You can start those summer and fall camps, and that can run, up to the start of next season. That would happen in late August. So, yeah, there you have it. My full manifesto, so to speak, in terms of not only this would be how I would change the college football calendar if I was the hypothetical commissioner of college football, but how it would also fundamentally change your sport as of right now. Hopefully, meaningful changes can be made regardless of who is in charge of the sport that not only allows for the sport to flow as smoothly as possible while maintaining the connective tissue that allows fans to feel more connected to their favorite sport, college football teams. Because as of right now, while the sport is still in a solid spot in terms of fan interest, I think that the next 5 to 10 years are really going to serve as how leadership handles the current fork in the road. Hopefully, that leadership begins to think about what it is that makes it in the best interest of the sport in both the short term and in the long term, instead of this continuous trend that we've seen in the last few years where they're really just thinking about what is the best for generating the most money possible in the right now. Again, thank you guys so much for letting me ramble on in terms of how I would fix college football. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you go ahead, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button as well if you do happen to be brand new. But this is Jake from College Football Red Zone signing off. Hoping you guys are all out there having a good night. Take care, everybody.